All right, this is chapter 32, stress and coping. Here are your objectives. All right, so let's talk about stress. We know that stress really is harmful to us, but it can also be a positive thing too. So physiological stress, it's just that harm to the body. Psychological stress, it's the emotion and the cognitive factors. And then the sociocultural stress is when social systems are challenged by factors. So this could be stress that comes from racism, economic hardship, or political upheaval. So stress is defined differently. I like the second one, that general adaptation syndrome, but it can really be that non-specific response of the body to any demand made upon it. And then that autonomic physiologic or emotional response to an internal or external environmental challenge. And it's usually beyond a person's resources or ability to respond, which is hard because it's usually those things we can't control that causes us the stress. And it's like we shouldn't stress about that because we can't control it. But inevitably, that's what happens. So we have a stressor and we have stress appraisal. If it's a stressor, it's an event or stimulus that really disrupts a person's sense of equilibrium, kind of throws us off a little bit. I know most of you are experiencing stress, so you're kind of feeling that. You could probably give me many signs and symptoms that you're experiencing right now. The stress appraisal is really the process by which a person interprets a stressor, and we see it as a threat, a challenge, maybe something good, as crazy as that sounds. So why is it so important to understand stress? Well, because it really determines its impact on the person's attitude and physiologic response. We have some people, and we talk about that as resilience. You guys will take a resilience course, so you're going to get a little bit more of this. But the way that we respond really depends and determines its impact. It can trigger pathologic changes in tissue, so we might have that local adaptation syndrome. And really just knowing the knowledge of stress, coping, and adaptation is important to healthcare personnel because it is really that link. Somebody could be doing really well, but if they're stressed, they're not going to heal, right? They're not going to get better. That's in all four dimensions when we talk about that. And we do have Sister Kalisa Roy's adaptation model, which I really, really like that, especially when I work and do my research with IPV, intimate partner violence, and human trafficking. And we adapt to our environments to survive. All right. So this is that scientific foundation. We know that our body always is trying to maintain homeostasis. We want that steady state. But then when we don't maintain that, we have a fight or flight response. And so we're either going to fight it or we're going to run. And it really kind of depends on what the stressor is. So with that general adaptation syndrome, or GAS, I like GAS, it is a physical response to stress. There are those three stages, so alarm, resistance, and then you're just exhausted. And some of you might have experienced that in week 3, and now when you get to week 4, you're almost in that exhaustion, maybe resistance. The distress is really the negative stress, and eustress can be positive. So stress can be positive. It can be motivational. Anything that just, remember, it throws us off our equilibrium, which may not be a bad thing all the time. But make sure as you go through this GAS that you look and see what happens in the physiological or physical response, what's happening, and then in that resistance, what's happening, and then recovery or exhaustion. And this is really the body's way of trying to protect itself and protect the core when we think of that. With the local adaptation syndrome, or LAS, it may manifest as inflammation, reflective response to pain, hypoxia, which is secondary to catecholamine release. And then allostasis is the means by which homeostasis is reestablished. Okay. Stress appraisal, the appraisal is the autonomic, often unconscious assessment of a demand or stressor. And so you're automatically deciding whether to fight or flight, really, truly. And you're deciding, is this something that needs to happen now, or is it just a challenge? So 2-stage evaluation, you're really trying to figure out the threat and the degree. And then are there coping options, or you're evaluating your coping options. Then the threat versus challenge, you're saying, okay, a threat, is this going to cause harm? And a challenge can hold a possibility of benefit. Like you might take on a challenge because there's higher dividends to be paid on the other end if you take on that challenge. So you have the sense of coherence, so a characteristic of personality that references one's perception of the world. So it's comprehensible, meaningful, manageable. Coping is the dynamic cognitive and behavioral efforts to manage demands, so internal or external, and it can be exceeding immediate available resources. Oh, defense mechanisms. This would be a good time for you to stop and pause and think about your own personal defense mechanisms and coping strategies. How do you handle things? They're unconscious, they're protective coping methods, and really our lived experiences really kind of help shape and define these. And we may not even understand why we're doing what we're doing because remember, it's unconscious. The use of defense mechanisms on a short-term basis, it may initially prevent harm. However, if you do it long term, it's not good. They're very unhealthy, and you can't grow, develop, and you can't have healthy communication, relationships, movement in that growth and development. Here are some defense mechanisms, whether you compensate, denial, displacement, intellectualization, projection, and rationalization. Make sure that you understand the definitions of each of these. And like I said, it's a good time to pause and say, okay, what do I do? What are my defense mechanisms? And you'll probably say, well, it depends on the situation. Okay. And this just continues. So regression, repression, reaction, formation, and sublimation. Some coping strategies. So how do we move beyond the defense mechanisms and learn how to cope in a healthy way? And so really, to be able to do this successfully, we have to think of the problem-focused and the emotion-focused efforts. Problem-focused is really those techniques aimed at altering or removing the stressor. And then in circumstances in which the problem may not have a solution, we have emotion-focused coping strategies. So work to ease the emotional distress associated with those stressful conditions. The normal structure and function, you guys, this should be just a refresher when we talk about the nervous system. Remember, we have those physical signs, and we think of the sympathetic nervous system. We have that stimuli that goes to the brain. Then we have the perception of that stressor. We have the hypothalamus, that it functions to adapt to stress. And then you have the nervous system. And so what happens in that nervous system? And you not need to know these because that's the signs and symptoms, right? Increased heart rate, cardiac output, blood flow to muscles, all is increased. You have the dilation of the bronchi, increased respiratory rate, and that pupillary dilation. And that is really to help you survive. It's the body's way of protecting the core. The immune response, pain, vasodilation, swelling, you might start to see that mobilization of white blood cells, the lymphocytes. In the endocrine system, the response is the adrenal medulla releases hormones. You have the sympathoadrenal response. You have the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal complex. You have the physiological and psychological stressors. And then you have the corticosteroid, hyperglycemia. We know that a lot of times, and you talk about like with weight loss, sometimes people that are very stressed, they have high corticosteroid levels and tend to maintain fat stores around their abdomens because of that. And so those are things like this is a real thing, and we need to be aware of as nurses as to how does stress impact our bodies. With the psychological responses, we've got age, nutritional status, genetic inheritance, influence response. We know that stress, there's a variation between everybody. Everybody handles stress differently. and how we appraise it, it's differently. Frequency and intensity of stress exposure, it does account for some differences. And then there's personality factors. And so the resilience, the flexibility, the resourcefulness can help us buffer stress and handle it better. And so how well an individual copes can modify responses to stress. All right, we're going to stop there and we'll pick up we'll continue this on part 2.